It's time for the Daily Stand Up Podcast presented by AgileDad with your host, Lee Henson. Without any further ado, let's get started. Right out of the gate, I keep getting these questions from people who generally are writing into AgileDad or people who are submitting requests via the website. And one of the number one requests I still get, believe it or not, is how do I choose between doing my project using Agile framework or whether I should use a more traditional framework like Waterfall? And there are many Agilists out there who would say there's very little room for Waterfall. In this case, I agree but disagree at the same time. The number of projects or the number of situations where Waterfall is perfectly appropriate is diminishing, but it doesn't mean that there's not a place for it. So let's have the conversation. So I think the first thing you need to look at is what kind of environment do you have? What development methodologies do you have? What exists? What's out there? And of course, if you're talking about frameworks or methodologies, if you're talking about doing this for an IT related project versus a non-technical project versus a project where you're drowning in heavy bureaucracy versus, big oversight, those type of things, these all play into what you choose. So the two main things that I want to talk about today, and I'll go into a little more detail, but the two main ones I want to talk about today obviously are traditional project management or waterfall versus the Agile framework. And when I say Agile framework, I'm talking about the greater Agile framework. And I think in order to best understand what I mean by the greater Agile framework, I often use the example of an open wheel racer. So if you're into open wheel racing, you would notice that some open wheel race cars, they have the garage where every single tool you could possibly think of is inside of the garage to rebuild the car. But then there's also the pit where the pit crew goes. And in the pit, they can do some very specific things. They can change the windshield, they can change the tires, they have very specific things they can do. Fuel up the car, but they're not able to do everything in the pit. So if you think about it from that perspective, when I talk about the greater Agile framework, I'm talking about everything that comes with Agile. So the five things that come to my mind right away are sprints or iterations, where you have a time box period that you're getting the work done in short bursts. Flexibility. So this allows you to be adaptable and understand that things change. So if you know there's going to be change in requirements or changes based on customers' feedback or market conditions, you need to be flexible. Collaboration, where people are willing to have regular face-to-face interactions, whether it be over a tool like Zoom or Teams, or whether it be in person. You just need regular short burst collaboration. You need to have an environment where review or feedback is welcome so that you can get feedback from your stakeholders and your customers on a big project. And you want to make sure that they understand that all of this revolves around minimal documentation. Now, notice I didn't say zero documentation. I said minimal. There is still the need for some documentation, even in the Agile framework. It doesn't have to be quite as heavyweight, and it doesn't have to be the same as what you're typically doing in traditional projects, but you do have to understand that some documentation is required. Now, that begs the next question. When I said Agile, how do I know which Agile to choose? I have people all the time who come to me. Do I do Scrum? Do I do Kanban? Do I do Lean? And they just give me the list. Do I do Extreme Programming? Do I do Dynamic Systems Development Method or Crystal? And the answer is yes. You pick what's going to work best for the culture of your organization based on the type of product or service you're building. So we can start with the most popular, Scrum. Scrum's the tried and true classic, right? It has a well-organized backlog. All the requirements are in there. The heartbeat of the Scrum belongs to the team, and the stakeholder acts as a pivotal figure to help guide the team towards success. Product owners own the actual product, and teams achieve goals in small bite-sized bursts. I know that's not everything, but I wanted to give you a Scrum in 20 seconds. It's just a carefully orchestrated, dynamic way to get things done. Works well in many situations. The only issue that many people have with Scrum is that it doesn't lend itself well to the ideation and to the discovery phases of a project. It does well with the execution, and delivery, and a release, But when it comes to ideation or discovery, you need to kind of amend Scrum or put something with it in order for it to work at its absolute peak performance. Then there's Kanban, or Kanban, depending on how you pronounce it. Kanban emphasizes visually understanding tasks on boards, on some type of visual indicator, limiting work in progress and optimizing flow. They do this by emphasizing that we need to focus on cycle time, how long does it take to build one of something, throughput, how many can we build in a certain amount of time, and then variance to make sure we're building things with excessive quality. The big key to Kanban is the enforcement of WIP limits. If you can enforce how much work remains in progress, it's going to help you deliver the right thing every time without overstretching your boundaries or without trying to do too many things at one time. It's going to cause you not to fall into analysis paralysis, and it's going to cause you never to have too many things in motion. Now, in my world, I believe that a combination of Scrum and Kanban is almost ideal in many situations. Many people refer to this as Scrumban. I feel like that works really, really well, especially for teams where they have certain work they need to do every single sprint to keep the lights on, and they're also fielding inbound requests or tickets from some type of ticketing system. That way, they can dedicate a percentage of their points to the work that's consistent and the remaining points to the work that comes in via tickets. So if you're a services organization or if you're handling tickets, maybe food for thought for you to investigate Scrum on. There's extreme programming. Extreme programming dives heavy into test-driven design and test-driven development and focuses on pair programming and peer review. The other key here is that if you're building something technical, that everyone owns the code. It's a collective code ownership. These things are important because they guide you to have higher quality, and they guide you to make sure that no one becomes a subject matter expert by themselves. That we have T-shaped teams and T-shaped individuals who understand with depth some things, but they also understand some breadth. If you put all that together, each one of these frameworks has their own strengths, and each one has its own weaknesses. Each one has a position in the overall Agile ecosystem. The problem is, I think too many people try to say, hey, I want it all. And when you try to do it all, it becomes overwhelming, and Agile teams struggle and falter. When you start to say you want it all, you start leaning back in towards traditional project management, which is interesting. When you think of Waterfall or traditional project management, which was introduced by Winston Royce, you wind up talking about things that if your project is structured, Waterfall follows a very structured, predefined process, linear. It follows a linear direction from one phase to another. It's documentation heavy because they want to make sure that they have everything picked out, designed, and laid out before you start. It is a bit rigid. So rigidity rules because there's no need to be flexible because changes have to go through a change control board and a change plan. It allows you to know exactly what you need to work on. And that leads me to the next one, which is predictable. Even though people like to say waterfall's not predictable, it certainly is. Because if you have a well-defined timeline and a well-defined budget, it makes it easier for you to say, we're just sticking to this. Whether good ideas come up or not, it doesn't matter. We'll build addendums later. This is our plan, and this is the direction we're going. It allows for sequential thinking. So it emphasizes completing each phase before moving on to the next. Now, the interesting thing here is when I said sequential thinking, one of the first things I thought of was WIP limits. When I said predictable, one of the things I thought of was short cycles. When I said rigidity, I thought of having a release plan or a roadmap to guide us. The point I'm trying to make is you can take these waterfall tendencies and you can pivot or adjust those into Agile. And I think this is where people struggle because the deeper you dive into Agile and the more rigid you become, the more it becomes a waterfall flow, which is really interesting. And then the last one is late feedback. Customer feedback is typically received all the way at the end of a product or project. But what's interesting is when you talk about late feedback, sometimes in Agile, I say late feedback is also happening because people give you feedback, anytime during a project. So you might get feedback, right before something needs to be done. So with that being said, the confusion stems from these two actually being more intersecting than you think, right? They're more interchangeable than you think. But the deal is, Agile's way different. Don't get me wrong, the two are totally different. But the confusion comes when you try to do too many heavy layers and when you try to become too process centric. That's the key. If you're trying to become too process-centric, that's when you're going to struggle. So how do you choose? Selecting the appropriate framework depends on a lot of factors, such as complexity of project, stability of requirements, the amount of customer involvement or engagement, organizational culture. Agile is often favored for projects where changing requirements are key and you want to focus on continual improvement. Waterfall is more suitable for stable, well defined, knowing exactly where you're going. I call them shampoo projects: wash, rinse, repeat, right? If you're doing that, then Waterfall may be your jam. What I can tell you is that either way, the choice is yours, whether you want to be a scrum master or product owner or a hardcore project manager. That's going to do it for today. I hope that this was helpful to you. If you have questions, comments, or something you want us to cover, feel free to reach out to us. Learn more at AgileDad.com. We would love to hear from you. And as always, we encourage you to stay healthy, stay well, and stay agile, my friends. Until next time, do take care.